So when you're practicing music, how do you know if you're practicing the right thing? Wouldn't it be great if there was a scientifically proven way to know whether or not a practice session was going to make you a better musician? Well, guess what? There is. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about that science and give you a quick demonstration of how to apply it in your own practice. So in the last episode, I talked about the purpose of practice, which is to stimulate our brain to change. So our goal isn't to get better during the practice itself. The goal is to signal the brain that it needs to change so that after that change in the future, you'll be a little bit better at whatever it is you're practicing. But that process requires structural remodeling in the brain, which happens over days, weeks, and even months. I also explained that for practice to be productive, it has to involve making mistakes. If we're not making mistakes, we've given our brain no reason to change, right? We've sent the signal that the status quo is perfect, right? This means that practicing things that are too easy are not going to stimulate the brain to change. On the other hand, practicing things that are too hard or beyond our current capabilities is also a problem. Remember, through trial and error, the brain is trying to build a neural network that can execute the task that we're working on. So if we rarely or never get it right, our brain doesn't get the feedback that it needs to know how to design that network. In that case, the practice is either unproductive or worse, it leads to habituating a poor solution to the task, which we also know as a bad habit. This brings us to the idea of a sweet spot, or a Goldilocks zone when it comes to practice. It's a zone where the level of difficulty is just right. Not too easy that we don't stimulate change, and not too hard that we risk building the wrong kinds of habits or stimulating the wrong kind of change. So how do you know if what you're practicing is in that sweet spot? That's a crucial question, and as always, we'll look to the research for answers. Fortunately, there is research on this topic, and I'm going to talk about one of my favorite studies in this area. So the study is titled Evidence of an Optimal Error Rate for Motor Skill Learning, and it was published in a preprint in July 2023. So it hasn't appeared in a journal yet, but it was conducted by researchers at Yale University, and in the study they took subjects and had them play 70 rounds of a modified version of the video game Pong. So in Pong, you control a paddle where you try to intercept a puck that's moving across the screen. And the researchers divided subjects into 4 groups and varied the difficulty of the game so that each group experienced different error rates. And they adjusted the difficulty by changing the size of the paddle from one trial to the next. So the target error rates for each of the 4 groups were 15%, 30%, 50%, and 65%. So for the 15% error rate group, for example, the difficulty was adjusted so that they failed to intercept the puck 15% of the time. For the 65% group, the difficulty was adjusted so that they missed 65% of the time or hit the puck 35%. The researchers wanted to know if the error rate affected how quickly the subjects improved at the game, and if so, what the optimal error rate was. In other words, they were trying to answer the question that I just asked, which is, how do you know if you're in the sweet spot of practice? So what did they find? They found that the group with the 30% error rate improved the most, while the group with the 15% rate improved the least. So there was a highly significant difference in the rate of improvement between the 30% and the 15% groups. And while the 30% group also improved faster than the 50% and the 65% groups, the difference was much less dramatic. So in other words, people who made mistakes about 30% of the time learned faster than those who made mistakes only 15% of the time. So as I've said, learning requires making mistakes. And again, this study is part of a large body of research on the optimal error rate for learning. And the general consensus right now is that an error rate of around 25% is generally ideal, although that can vary depending on the task. So what does this mean for you and your practice? how should this concept of a sweet spot and the research on the optimal error rate impact the way you practice? I think the single most important takeaway is that your practice will be most productive if you're in or near the sweet spot. And again, making mistakes is the key to learning. As I've often said, one of the biggest reasons that adults don't learn as quickly as kids is because we often avoid making mistakes. We either stick to things that are too easy, that we've already mastered, or we give up out of frustration when we do make mistakes. But as this research shows, that can really hold us back. In this study, the group that made mistakes 15% of the time learned the slowest, even compared to those who messed up more than half the time. So when you're practicing anything, think about whether you're in the sweet spot, whether or not you're messing up enough. Is it too easy? Are you just repeating things that you already know how to do and not pushing yourself because you don't like to mess up? Or is it too hard? Are you making mistakes almost all the time and you need to dial back the difficulty? I think a good rule of thumb is to aim for a 25 to 50% error rate. That means making mistakes a quarter to a half the time, or alternatively, getting it right 50 to 75% of the time. And you can track this if you want. For example, you could play a passage 10 times and see how many times you get it right. But for many people, that could sap some of the joy out of it. While others might love tracking their practice with this level of precision, regardless, the most important thing is to simply be mindful of whether or not what you're practicing is too easy or too hard. Make sure that you're making enough mistakes to keep improving, but also getting it right at least half the time. And if it's too easy, then make it more challenging. And if it's too hard, simplify it until it's in the sweet spot. Now I'm going to give you a demonstration of different ways that you can bring something into the sweet spot on the banjo. But first, I wanted to make an exciting announcement, which is that a new and expanded edition of my book, The Loss of Brainjo, is being released by Penguin Random House in March of 2025 under the title, Anyone Can Play Music: How to Unlock Your Musical Potential with the Laws of Brainjo. So it's all about the neuroscience of why and how anyone can learn to play music at any age. So if you want to learn more about the neuroscience behind learning, along with loads of practical advice on how to apply that science to exponentially improve the effectiveness of your practice, just like we do in these Brainjo Bites, then I think you'll love the book. It's available for pre-order now, or if you're watching this after March 18th, 2025, it's already out, and there's a link in the description. You can also find it by searching Anyone Can Play Music or my name, Josh Turknet, on Amazon or other online booksellers. Okay, so let's take an example of how we can utilize this concept of a sweet spot in our practice. So let's say that I'm learning the tune Blackberry Blossom, and I hear the A part a particular way, or at least the first part of the A part, and I want to be able to play it like this. But there are a few tricky spots in playing it that way and getting those particular notes. There's a alternate string pull off in the beginning, right there, that requires me to be ready for that, to plan ahead. That can get tricky once it's moving towards sort of performance tempo. And then halfway through that A part, I've got this pull off, and I've got to get all the way down here again for that next note. There. Another tricky transition that also gets harder as you build tempo. So let's say that I'm practicing this particular section at 100 beats per minute. So I'm going to play a drum backup track and try to keep up with that. And I can't do it, right? So what do? I'm not in the Goldilocks zone, right? I'm messing up more than half the time. So I need to bring it down. Not too easy, not too hard. One option, slow it down, right? So I might move it to, say, 60 beats per minute and see if I can get it. right, so there I'm doing much better, right? I'm not only in the sweet spot, it might be a little bit too easy. So I might want to ramp up the tempo to maybe 70 beats per minute, 80 beats per minute, wherever I feel like I've gotten to that point where it's not too easy, but also not too hard that I'm messing up more than half the time. So that's one way to just slow it down. Another way would be to shorten what I'm playing, right? So instead of playing that whole phrase, I could play half of it. All right, and I'll try that at 100 beats per minute. Alright, so that is much more manageable. Again, I brought it down in the sweet spot, maybe even a little too easy, so that I could then maybe try to get to that next section. Or I could try just that transition part at a slower tempo, right? That's 60 beats per minute until I can bring that up to tempo. So that's another option. Another one would be to just simplify what I'm playing. So I mentioned there are two kind of tricky spots. There's that first alternate string pull-off, and then there's this transition where this last pull-off note, if I get that, I got to go all the way back here for the next note. So that's a rapid switch to make. So what I could do is just eliminate those two pull-offs and play it like this. All right, and I might try that with the 100 beats per minute back up. And if I feel like I'm in the Goldilocks zone, or if it's too easy, then I could add in one of those pull-offs. Like that. And then I can continue to build, keeping things in my sweet spot. So again, the key there being, if it's too hard, simplify. And so some of our options for simplification are to slow it down. We can shorten the phrase. We can make what we're playing a little bit easier technically, and then get into the Goldilocks zone. Once we've gotten to where we're out of the Goldilocks zone and it's too easy, then we can start adding complexity and adding back in the elements that we've removed to simplify it in order to get to my goal in the end. So again, this is a critical concept, and it's another powerful example of the fact that how we practice is what determines our success. Remember, in this study, the thing that determined who improved the most wasn't anything about the subjects themselves, but about how they practiced. This is why, for aspiring musicians, there's nothing more important than learning how to learn. Understanding how to stimulate brain change and making sure that change moves us in the direction that we want is the key to our success. Because if you get that right, then your success is inevitable. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next Brainjo Bite. Thank you for watching this Brainjo Bite. To catch future episodes, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you haven't already done so. You can also hear these episodes on the Brainjo Jam podcast, and you'll find a link to that in the video description. Also, if you'd like to boost your brain health and function with neuroscience-based musical instruction for banjo, ukulele, fiddle, and piano, head over to brainjo.academy.